Hi there, everyone. So we're back this week with another lecture for week 3 of the course. This week we're talking about phrase, form, and texture. So in our last episode, last time we were all together, we took a look at notation, rhythm and melody and harmony. And these kind of make up some of the last really fundamental building blocks. And so phrase, form, and texture are going to be our first looks at kind of what happens when you start to combine these things, and kind of what structures do they form in music that composers can use to make great music, or that performers can manipulate during their performances. The first one is phrase. So phrase, according to the Oxford Musics Dictionary, it's a short section of music, composition of a musical composition, into which the music, whether vocal or instrumental, seems naturally to fall. Okay, that's a fine definition. I like it. But it kind of relies on the listener and kind of to perceive what a phrase is, and I think that's largely right. Many people will think of a phrase in a song and come up with different definitions, even if they're listening to the same thing. But for ease, when I think of a phrase, I usually think of like writing, and so like writing a sentence in particular. So phrase as sentences. In literature, of course, we all know a sentence is a set of words that is complete within itself. It's complete thought. Sentences are little small units, and when you have lots of them, they add up to something that's much larger, maybe an essay or a book. In the same way, a phrase is a single musical idea. A phrase serves to build tension or to release tension within music, and lots of phrases make up a full piece of music, right? So a phrase by itself is generally not an entire piece of music, although it could be. Just like a sentence by itself is generally not an entire work of literature, although it could be. Okay, so a phrase is like several notes in a melody linked together. It might not be the entire melodic idea, but it is a segment or a unit of that. The cool thing about phrase is that it hands over a lot of control to the performer, because as we mentioned earlier, different people will perceive the phrase or what is a phrase in a single song in many different ways. Composers will often try to influence how we think of phrasing, and we'll talk a little bit about how they do that a little bit later. But the final interpretation is left to the performer. So performers will choose how they want to group notes together into phrases. For example, in this piece of music we see here, right? We've used it a lot in this class. Mary Had a Little Lamb. The performer could choose to sing this, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. However, with a breath every measure, it doesn't sound really good, or a release of the line every measure. So instead, this time, I'm going to sing it legato, which means I'm going to sing from the first measure to the end of the fourth measure all in one phrase. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Right? That sounds better than a breath between each one, because it's a complete musical thought, right? And it starts over the second time we talk about Mary, right, on bar 5. I think this makes more sense, and I think most people who would play it that way. Same thing, if I was going to play the same thing on the piano, I wouldn't pause there, I'd keep going. Right? I don't pause in between those. I continue it from the beginning, the first word Mary, all the way to the last lamb at the end of 4. And that's a single musical phrase. You think of the flow of the music, right? But what about instrumental music? So instrumental music is the same way, and this doesn't only apply to instrumental music. Thinking about it now, I think like this definitely applies to vocal music as well. But in particular with music, the way that composers, as we mentioned earlier, will try to shape our understanding of the phrase of a piece, especially if they want very specific phrasing, they'll often use slurs and ties. Slurs and ties. You can see an example on the top picture on the right-hand side here. Okay, so a tie is a curved line connecting the heads of two notes that are on the same pitch. Okay, a tie indicates that we combine these two pitches and that they're the same rhythm. So if I'm looking, not the same rhythm, but you add those two rhythms together, right? You join them. So if I look in the example here, this first example on the right-hand side in the top picture, that rhythm, if it had no tie, would go 1, 2, 3, 4. But because it has a tie, I'm going to tie the second beat and the third beat together. So instead it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? I don't clap 4 times. I only clap 3 because I've tied the two middle notes together. Okay? In music, there's also something called a slur. So if ties tie together the same notes, so they have to be the same pitch, slurs do a similar thing but with different pitches. Okay, a slur is a curved line indicating that the notes it encompasses are meant to be played without separation. A slur can tie different notes together. So in this example, it plays this. If I played it with no slurs, it would sound like this. But with slurs, it sounds like this. And so I link the first one, ba da da da, instead of ba 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 ba. Right? One is what we call legato or connected. So there's no space between the notes, and the other one's called staccato or separated. Right? There's separation between those. A slur connects them together. There's a really great explanation in this video. If you want to go more in depth between the difference of slurs and ties, I welcome you to watch that. But I think, those are the basic ideas. Okay, so that's phrase. How do we phrase a musical idea? Now we're thinking about form, and form is a larger idea. Way back in 1939, the famous American composer Aaron Copland, who I'd highly recommend listening to in your free time, wrote a book. It's great. I would recommend going out and getting it. I think you can get it on Amazon used for like $2 or $3, right? It's a great addition to your library. It's called What to Listen For in Music. And if you're in this class, I think it'd be a great supplement if you continue to be interested in like, what am I listening for in music, or you want to understand more particularly about classical music. But in this book, Copland says, quote, "Almost anyone can more readily distinguish melodies and rhythms, or even harmonies, than the structural background of a lengthy piece of music." He's saying it's much more difficult to understand the structure of a piece of music than it is to understand these individual parts like a melody or a rhythm or harmony. People can pick those out more easily with their ears. And the reason it's often forgotten about is because you have to pay very close attention to be able to understand form. Whereas a single phrase might unfold over the course of 4 seconds. Form, the idea of form, is something that you have to be actively listening for 3 minutes, in some songs, 5 minutes, in some symphonies, 30 minutes, right, to fully grasp the form. In some larger pieces of opera, hours, right, of listening, and listening intently in order to understand form. Okay? And as Copland suggests, form refers to the structure of an entire musical composition or performance. Okay, so we're talking about big pieces here. We've gone from talking about individual units of like a measure of music to entire performances. So form is focused on the bigger picture. Here's some common musical forms. So we'll start off kind of, I hope this unfolds in a way that's like easy to comprehend. The first one we're going to talk about is through composed. If you have a piece of music that's through composed, what it means is that there are no internal repetitions. Once I play through a portion of the song or a section of the song, I never come back to it. I like to think of it as in poetry, right? When we're taught in school to diagnose poetry, we say that if a line rhymes with another rhyme, then we label them with the same letter. So you could have AABB, which means that the first 2 lines rhyme together and the second 2 lines rhyme together, right? But line 1 and line 3 don't rhyme together, right? Through composed, if we think of it like that, it would be a song that was like A, B, C, D, E, right? But it never repeats. Each section is independent. and it slides from one section to another without ever coming back to reprise any of the ideas. As always with music, I think it's much more helpful to listen to things and to experience those musical ideas than it is just to talk about them. So some examples, I've put Happiness is a Warm Gun here by the Beatles, but some other examples are Bohemian Rhapsody is a great one, Paranoid Android, which I think is in the listening examples for this week, are all examples of through composed music. The next one is binary form, so compositions that are made up of two sections that are distinct and that you might repeat back to later, but two distinct sections, so like an A, a B, and then maybe later you come back to A and then back to B. These are going to be called binary, so two distinct sections. While the sections may have minor changes when they're repeated, the material is basically always the same. My favorite example of this, which I think is one of the most underrated pieces of jazz music, is Black Narcissus by Joe Henderson. I've included that again in the listening examples, but we have a little bit of the lute suite from by Bach in E minor here on this slide that you can watch and kind of get an idea. If you listen through this, you'll hear there's two very distinct sections in this, right? And it sometimes goes back and repeats the first or repeats the second, right? But there's only two distinct sections. The next one is pop song form. I want to shout out to Christopher for recommending this in our forum as a class. But for this example, I focused on the Weeknd's Blinding Lights, which I think is like in the top 20 on the Billboard charts right now, maybe even in the top 10. The modern pop song has been nearly perfected. So when we think back to pop music, think about Motown, think about kind of the Tin Pan Alley and where popular music in this country came from. It came largely from businesses. It became a huge business, right? People make a lot of money from producing, writing pop music. And so over the years, we have, with addition, help, from the rest of the world, slowly we figured out a formula that really works. It really, really sticks. And we call this the pop song form. Okay, in pop song form, there are basically 4 or 5, depending on how you count it, distinct sections. We have an intro, a verse, a pre-chorus, a chorus, and a bridge. Right? These are our sections. Sometimes you might be missing one of these in a given pop song, or it might be slightly rearranged. But this form that I've listed here, intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge, chorus. This idea is kind of like the most fundamental version of the pop song form. And if you listen to The Weeknd in this example, it follows this exactly. There's an instrumental opening, his first verse where some of the instruments come out. We have the little pre-chorus that builds up to the big chorus of the song that is the one that you sing along to, and then it repeats. And the only difference here between the verse and the chorus is eventually right before the end, we have what we call the bridge, which is a section that is different than everything that came before it. They're usually more contemplative sections, a little bit maybe more intimate sounding, and then of course we finish up with a big chorus. Again, so much music follows this pop song form. Yeah, this is just one example, but I thought it was timely because Christopher brought it up. So thanks for that. Next, we have strophic form. So earlier when we were talking about through compose, we said that if through compose was a poem, it would be like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on, right? That there's no rhyming, right? Or it never returns to a section or anything. Strophic form is kind of like that, except I guess kind of the mirror opposite. So rather than being lots of different sections and there's no repetition, strophic form, there's only one section and it repeats over and over and over, right? Strophic form is particularly popular in vocal music. Lots of art songs from the 18 and 1900s were written in strophic form. Lots of American folk tunes are written in strophic form. It's often very useful for telling stories, as we see in this example, Mac the Knife by Louis Armstrong and his band. and so basically you have the same piece of music, and the only thing that changes is the lyrics that go over it, right? It's going to play the same thing over and over, and each time I'm going to tell another little piece of the story. Louis Armstrong, his eyes are kind of popping out here. He looks like he's in the middle of channeling the character of Mac the Knife, which, as the story of Mac the Knife, is fairly interesting if you want to look into it on your own. But anyway, so strophic form is the same section repeated over and over, right? And we return to it, but usually just with different words each time. Okay. Okay, our third big idea that we're thinking about this week is the idea of texture. Texture. And texture describes how the tonal, harmonic, rhythmic, and timbral elements combine in a piece of music. Texture is often described in ways that are similar to the ways we describe timbre. So you might hear people saying like harsh or gritty or smooth or shrill. But I think that what is more important when we're talking about texture is that we talk about the density or the thickness of the sound, right? So texture has more to do with when we have multiple instruments playing at the same time. We often don't hear discussions of texture when it's only one instrument playing. Okay, that would be a discussion of timbre. Texture is usually, discussions are usually had about larger pieces of music with many instruments playing. And based on the way I combine those different instruments, I can achieve different textures, right? And again, that's why we might use language surrounding the ideas of thickness or density when we talk about texture. Here on the right, we have a spectrogram with a tiny little excerpt from Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, another great piece of music if you want to listen in your free time. But this video doesn't play the whole thing. Instead, it plays just a little segment. And what we can see with the spectrogram is that as the kind of pink or reddish or yellowish color begins to pop out, what that means is there's more intensity of those frequencies. So lower frequencies on the bottom, higher frequencies or loudness kind of as it goes up. And we can see there's a very distinct line there, and you'll hear this in the music when you're listening. You'll see when that line of red kind of pops up, that big vertical line, and it's because there's an explosion of sound in the orchestra. The beginning is not as dense as it is in that last kind of 1/4 there at the end. It's a very dense orchestration there at the end. And that's what we talk about texture. Okay, we have some key terms. Again, I would look over these. I think that'd be the best advice I could give someone who wanted to do really well on the quiz, is to look over these key terms. And we have some listening examples. The listening examples are a little bit different this time around. It's hard to read the bottom one. They're a little bit different this time around. Usually I label them as, hey, listen to this song to hear this idea, or listen to this other song to hear this other idea that we talked about. This time I think, because we're getting into ideas that are larger ideas, they're not just about single notes or about scales or something. They're about larger structures of music. I think each of these songs can contribute something to the idea of phrase, form, and texture. The one that I think really stands out is the one on the bottom that is hard to see, Bolero by Maurice Ravel, the famous French composer. It's also the only piece, I think, of classical music that I've put on here for this week. What I like about this piece is, Maurice Ravel in his time, after he wrote it, he thought it was a complete failure. But it ended up being one of his most popular pieces of music, and he thought it was a failure because this piece of music is basically a single melody or kind of like a long extended phrase that is repeated over and over, and every time the orchestra repeats it, it starts off with just like a snare drum and I think a woodwind, oboe, or clarinet or flute or something. And as the song goes on, every time it repeats that musical idea, it adds another section of the orchestra in. And slowly over time, the sound becomes louder and louder and louder and louder until you have the full orchestra in all at once, right? I think I've heard people describe that it's supposed to be, if you close your eyes and listen to it, you're supposed to be able to imagine that there is imagine you're in the French countryside somewhere, and in a field, and you start to hear the sound of a military band far away, off in the distance. And you can see just barely a few little dots of people begin to crest the hill, kind of at the horizon. And slowly, as that military band gets closer and closer and closer to you, which would be the repeating of these phrases over time, the band becomes louder, right? And you start to see there's more people in the military band. It's much larger than you initially heard. The sound is much more clear. So that's kind of, I think, what it's supposed to bring up for the listener. But I think that, in particular, is a great example of texture, because you can slowly hear how the texture is built over time, and how an orchestra sounds different when there's only certain sections playing versus when the full orchestra playing. I think that's just a master class in that sort of thing. Okay. This, I think, was like a shorter week than normal. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to start getting into histories of particular Western musical periods. I'm also going to do my best to toss in some information about music from around the world, in all sorts of countries, not just in Europe, because believe it or not, the Europeans were not the only ones to be making music, right? And so I, as a musician, am interested in music beyond what was happening just there. So hopefully I can give you guys an idea of that. If you ever need anything, please email me at kyle.berry@hdtc.edu. Otherwise, I hope you have a great evening. All right, goodbye.